everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're covering the final part of the Eberron Unearthed Arcana that was recently released by Wizards of the Coast about a week ago at this point. We've covered the Artificer base class already and compared that to the original revision in the playtest material back in December. And then last week we also covered the new Cartographer subclass for the Artificer. And today we're finishing it off with the new feats, or new-ish feats for the Eberron setting. Some of these are very similar to species traits that we saw before in the Eberron setting back in the day. And then there's a bunch of new feats that also build off of those. It's going to start off pretty kind of predictable and kind of minor changes and minor buffs. Some cool things to look at there, but it'll get much more exciting by the end. I was actually wondering how exciting this video is actually going to be as I was going through it. And then again, once I finally got to the end of the feats and saw the last two that are on this video, I was much more excited about the content that is present here. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right into it and see what we're working with. So the Eberron setting has what are called Dragonmark Feats. So the pre-2024 Eberron setting, the Dragonmarks were associated with specific species, as you can see on the left-hand side here. These were essentially variants of those species, sort of like the variant human or like the rock gnome or the mountain dwarf, things like that. You can still see these variants on D&D Beyond. However, in the Unearthed Arcana that they released for Eberron, species traits that were once attached to species are then going to be attached to what are presumably going to be their backgrounds. It does mention in the Unearthed Arcana that they will be associated with Eberron backgrounds. They didn't specifically say if those backgrounds will be specific to certain species. I doubt that'll be the case. Again, I don't know much about the Eberron setting, I will say that. So I don't know if there's a reason that only certain species have certain marks, but it seems like at least they're doing away with that. So you have sort of two groups of feats. One are the Dragonmark Feats. These are basically your Eberron setting origin feats, so they'll be associated with the Eberron backgrounds. You have your general feats, which are going to be called the Greater Dragonmark Feats. Each Greater Dragonmark feat is a improved version of one of the base Dragonmark feats, so it kind of builds off it as a prerequisite. There's an additional feat that we haven't seen before called Potent Dragonmark. And then there's also an epic boon that they added as well. So I don't know if they're releasing an actual adventure with the Eberron setting or if it's just sort of a campaign setting book without any actual adventure in it. But that might be a sign that we might see another high-level adventure for Eberron coming out. One thing we'll notice about all of the Dragonmark feats is that all the origin feats, the Dragonmark feats themselves, they have a prerequisite of being in an Eberron campaign. They are also exclusive. You can't have another Dragonmark feat, so you can't have more than one of these origin type of Dragonmark feats. Likewise, the Epic Boon also has a prerequisite of being in an Eberron setting, and then the Greater Dragonmark and the Potent Dragonmark feats don't have that prerequisite, but you need to have one of the origin Dragonmark feats to get those feats, so they kind of, by the transitive property, have a prerequisite of being in an Eberron setting. Of course, I know that my playgroup has ignored those kind of rules for like the Strixhaven backgrounds and things like that if we wanted to do those in certain campaigns where we can do that. We are always able to ignore those rules if our DM allows it, but I think especially with these Dragonmark feats, you might want to hold off on approving that if they publish these basically as is. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the actual feats. So first things first, we're starting with the Aberrant Dragonmark. We have the pre-2024 version on the left side and the UA version on the right side. Notably, the Aberrant Dragonmark was the only one previously that was an actual feat. This one was not associated with a specific species. However, this time it has moved to its own sort of origin Dragonmark feat. And one pattern that we will notice with all of these things is that any ability score increase that came with them, specifically for the origin type Dragonmark feats, of course, those have been removed because, of course, the origin feats don't have an ability score increase that comes with them. So no longer has the ability score increase for Constitution. At the bottom on the left here, you can see that it also no longer includes the flaw that the Aberrant Dragonmark gives you because it had like a certain visible flaw on you. For the actual changes, you now have a feature called Aberrant Fortitude. It says when you make a Constitution saving throw, you can roll 1d4 and add the number rolled to the save. You can use this benefit a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, and you regain all expended uses when you finish a long rest. So that's pretty cool. Very good for, spellcasters who want to buff their concentration checks. So that feature is just completely new. Additionally, you have Aberrant Magic, which was a similar feature to what it was before. So you can still choose one sorcerer, cantrip, and first level spell. Instead of casting it through your Dragonmark, you're just now casting it without a spell slot. Effectively the same, but they're now saying without a spell slot. You can now cast it more than once per short or long rest if you have spell slots that you can cast it with as well. So those are the two main changes. We get the one new feature in Aberrant Fortitude, the Aberrant Magic, and we'll see this pattern for all of the origin feats that you can now cast things without a spell slot. You can now cast them with any spell slots that you have. Pretty much everything else from the original feat is still intact. There's one other thing that at least wasn't in the Unearthed Arcana, and because they're releasing an epic boon with the material, or presumably they're releasing an epic boon with the material, they probably won't include this. And this was in the original Eberron setting. They had an optional feature for this feat called Greater Aberrant Powers. So basically, once you reached 10th level, you had a cumulative 10% chance to gain an epic boon from the Dungeon Master's Guide. So this whole option seems to be gone now, but it is replaced with just this sort of origin feat that we see on the right-hand side. Now we're looking at the Greater Aberrant Dragonmark. This is the general feat version, so you need to be level 4 or higher for it. And you also need to have the Aberrant Dragonmark feat. All of the Greater Dragonmark feats have the prerequisite of needing the base origin feat for it. This one specifically increases your constitution by 1 up to 20. It has a feature called Improved Intuition that says when you use your Aberrant Fortitude, that's the one that buffed your constitution saving throws, you can roll a d6 instead of a d4. And then has a feature called Mark of Inspiration. It says when you cast a cantrip, you can expend one of your hit point dice and roll it. You gain temporary hit points equal to the number rolled, and then one creature of your choice within 30 feet of you, not including you, takes force damage equal to the number rolled. And then you can do that a number of times equal to your constitution modifier. And this setup is basically going to be the same across all of the Greater Dragonmark feats. It's going to be some sort of ability score increase. It's going to have an improved intuition or very similar feature for it, where it improves the sort of buff to one of your checks or saves that you get from the base feat. And there's going to be something that improves one of the features that you get from the base feat as well. So this one's pretty cool. This one offsets the loss of the hit point die by giving you more temporary hit points. It's not the exact same amount, but it's close enough. A little more damage, that's not bad. But let's go ahead and continue looking at the other marks. So we're starting with the mark of detection. So again, like I said at the beginning, all ability score increases will be removed because these are no longer tied to species. Deductive intuition now grants a bonus to perception checks in place of an investigation. For magical detection, we can now see that, again, you can cast these things once without a spell slot. You can continue casting them with spell slots if you have them. Instead of just being able to cast them through that feature, you now always have them prepared. That's a small wording change that I think was worth noting. And then as well, we're also seeing that you can pick your mental stat to choose as your spell casting ability for it. Whereas previously this one was just intelligence. You can now use intelligence, wisdom, or charisma, your choice when you pick this feat. It's also worth pointing out that you can no longer ignore the material components for these spells, which you could before. And another pattern that we'll see is that now that you permanently have these spells prepared through this feature, if those spells were in the expanded spell list, but they were then removed and then replaced with something else. So in this case, we can see that Identify is replacing Detect Poison and Disease. What about the Greater Mark of Detection? So you can increase one ability score of your choice by 1 to a maximum of 20. That's going to be the same for all of the other Greater Dragon Marks. Again, improved intuition basically buffs the original intuition of the feat from a d6 to a d4, just like the previous one did. Then it's the bottom feature that we're really going to talk about with each greater feat, because that is the one that actually changes from one mark to the next. So in this case, we have improved detection. It says when you cast See Invisibility, which is one of the spells that you get from your origin feat, you can modify it so that for the duration, you have advantage on initiative rolls, and enemies that roll initiative within 30 feet of you can't gain initiative on the roll. Once you do this, you can't do it again until you finish a long rest. So See Invisibility has a 1-hour duration. So if you're kind of just entering a dungeon, or you're just about to enter combat, you can cast it on yourself. It doesn't matter if there's going to be invisible enemies or enemies in the ethereal plane, just to have advantage on initiative rolls and to possibly be able to prevent an enemy from having an advantage on initiative. That's also very good. It's going to take one of the spells that you get from your origin feat and improve on it in some way. I actually kind of like that a lot, because See Invisibility is not a spell that you would kind of cast all the time, but you get it for free at least once per day. And now they're giving you a reason to at least cast it once per day by just giving yourself advantage on initiative rolls for 1 hour. Moving on, we have the Mark of Finding. In the species traits, we see that Dark Vision and the languages were removed, of course. That's no surprise. Finder's Magic has all of the same spellcasting changes that we saw for the previous one. And then because we have Locate Object always prepared, this was then replaced with Mind Spike down in the expanded spell list. The Mark of Finding gives us Hunter's Mark, and that is what the Greater Mark of Finding is going to buff. So let's look at that. If you look at the Greater Mark of Finding, it then has Improved Finding, where it says when you cast Hunter's Mark, you can modify it so that the target can't benefit from the invisible condition for the duration of the spell. And then once you do this, you can't do it again until you finish a long rest. I think this one is kind of a big step down from the previous one. Having advantage on initiative rolls for an hour is actually a pretty powerful effect. That's a feature that you're going to be able to use every adventuring day, no matter what. Whereas you're not always going to run into an invisible creature every adventuring day. And depending on what you're encountering, it's probably not going to come up really all that often. Like I said, I think this one is kind of a big step down. This is one I think that they could deal with buffing a little bit, just so that it's more generally useful. Being able to see an invisible creature and make sure that they can remain visible to both you and your allies is very strong. It doesn't give you a reason to cast that spell at least once a day. Moving on to the Mark of Handling. Again, it has the exact same spellcasting changes, and because we have Animal Friendship and Speak with Animals always prepared now, the expanded spell list was replaced with Command and Find Familiar. Both of those are great spells. And then as we move on to the greater mark of handling, we can see that it has improved handling that says, while mounted, immediately after you hit a target within 5 feet of your mount with a melee attack roll, your mount can take a reaction to move up to its speed or take the attack action to make one attack only, your choice. So reading this just now, I realized that I kind of misread it the first time that I did. Hello everyone, Editor Gerg here. So I was actually just confused. I went off on about like a 30-second, almost a minute maybe long rant about how much I was confused by this improved handling feature. It turned out I was just wrong because I didn't understand how mounted combat works, so I went ahead and refreshed myself on it. When you're using a creature as a mount, the only actions it can normally take are dash, disengage, or dodge. So this feature would then allow it to take the attack action after you have struck a creature with a melee attack within 5 feet of the mount. So that's how this works. And this would apply for any mount that you buy at a stable, or the Find Steed spell, or the Find Greater Steed spell. They all work the same way. Back to the show. Moving on, we have the Mark of Healing. The Medical Intuition feature now specifically benefits an Intelligence Herbalism Kit check. Previously, this was just an ability check with an Herbalism Kit. The reason for this is probably because in the 2024 Player's Handbook, all artisan tools and kits have a specific ability that is associated with them, that you're supposed to use that ability whenever you make an ability check with that kit or tool. Again, I'm personally not a fan of that. I think there are definitely situations where different ability checks can come up. So I don't like that they're locking you into intelligence with this feature. And then we'll see later on as well that they are not consistent with this kind of wording. But moving on, we can see that Healing Touch again has all the same spellcasting changes. And then in the expanded spell list, we have False Life replacing Cure Wounds and Arcane Vigor replacing Lesser Restoration. Arcane Vigor, of course, is a new self-healing spell in 2024. Moving on to the Greater Mark of Healing. So this one has improved healing that says when you cast Cure Wounds and roll dice to determine the number of hit points restored, you can treat any roll of 1 or 2 as a 3. So basically you can't roll below a 3. This one is actually much more powerful within the 2024 rules because Cure Wounds heals for double the number of dice per spell level. And while effects like this that basically say you can't roll below a 3 on a d6 on a single die aren't that mathematically impressive, when you're rolling multiple die, that floor actually becomes very, very powerful. So this is actually really a strong feature if you're trying to play a healing character using these Aberrant feats. For the Mark of Hospitality, we actually don't see that many changes other than the changes to the spellcasting that we already know. But I do want to point out one thing that Forever Hospitable up here at the top, it says when you make a Charisma Persuasion check, same as before, or an ability check using brewer supplies or cook's utensils. Remember previously that we saw that the Herbalism Kit said Intelligence Herbalism Kit, whereas this should say supposedly, I believe it's Wisdom Brewer Supplies or Intelligence Cook Utensils based on the 2024 Player's Handbook. You could argue that they didn't include that here because they're mentioning 2 different ones and maybe they didn't want to fill in all that text. But of course, by doing that, they're making it so that any ability check that you roll using those supplies can get the benefit of this feature. Whereas for the previous one that said Intelligence Herbalism Kit, if you were making a Wisdom check with your Herbalism Kit, you would not be able to benefit from that feature. I like the wording here better, but I'm just pointing out the inconsistency. For the Greater Mark of Hospitality, they have Inspired Hospitality. It says when you cast Purify Food and Drink, you can modify the spell so that each creature of your choice within 30 feet of you is magically refreshed. Each affected creature has its exhaustion level reduced by 1, and it gains temporary hit points equal to your proficiency bonus plus your Intelligence, Charisma, or Wisdom modifier chosen when you selected this feat. And then you can do that once per long rest. So again, they're taking a spell that you probably wouldn't think to cast very often. They're just giving you a reason to cast the spell at least once per day. Because this is basically like an alternate to the Inspiring Leader feat. It also reduces your exhaustion level by 1, which is something that you need greater restoration to do. So that's also very cool. So overall, yeah, I like this one a lot. For the Mark of Making, we start with Artisan's Intuition, and that specifically states that it benefits an Intelligence Arcana check. Previously just said an Arcana check. I would bet that was probably a typo originally. And then we see that Magic Weapon, since we always had the prepared through Spellsmith, and the expanded spell list was then replaced with Spiritual Weapon. Spiritual Weapon is still a good spell, but it was slightly nerfed in 2024, where it now requires concentration for everyone who isn't a War Domain Cleric. It's still a very good spell for people who maybe don't have anything better to concentrate on, but I did want to call that out. So if we're then looking at the Greater Mark of Making, we have Improved Making. It says when you cast Magic Weapon, you can modify that spell so that the first time you attack with a weapon on each of your turns, you can transfer some or all of that weapon's bonus to your armor class. For example, if the bonus is +2, you can reduce the bonus to your attack rolls and damage rolls to +1 and then gain +1 to armor, or +2 and then gain +2 to armor. The adjusted bonus remains in effect until the start of your next turn, although you must hold the weapon to gain the bonus to AC from it. Then again, you can use this feature only once per long rest. So if you're familiar with magic items, you would recognize this this effect as the defender. This is basically turning any non-magic weapon into a mini defender, depending on what spell slot you use to cast this spell. And again, I think for anyone who's maybe wanting to just do a character type where I'm just going to try to get my AC as high as possible, they would definitely be looking at the mark of getting a defender for free, essentially, is actually a very powerful effect. So again, just a really cool feature that I think is worth building around if you want to. Moving on to the Mark of Passage. So we have Courier Speed. This now says that your speed increases by 5 feet, whereas previously it said that your walking speed increases to 35 feet. So this now is going to interact better with species that have a faster speed already. Aren't many of them, but there are some. Intuitive Motion now benefits strength athletics checks instead of ability checks to operate or maintain a land vehicle. You know, athletics checks are definitely much more common, so it's nice to have a more common ability check there at least. And then for the expanded spell list, since we already have Misty Step always prepared, we instead get Find Steed. Find Steed is a fine spell to have for sure. But then if we look at the greater Dragonmark of Passage, we have Inspired Passage. It says when you cast Misty Step, you can modify the spell so that you bring one willing creature you are touching with you. That creature teleports to an unoccupied space within 5 feet of you. And then of course, once you do this, you can't do it again until you finish a long rest. So basically you can turn Misty Step into a very short range sort of dimension door. The Misty Step is already a very good spell. Now it's even better, at least once per day. Then going on to the Mark of Scribing. Not many changes here, just a small change to the expanded spell list since we already have the Comprehend Languages spell always prepared. They changed that out for Command. Again, Command is a very good spell. And again, if we look at the Gifted Scribe at the top, it says you get the bonus to an ability check using Calligrapher Supplies, whereas Calligrapher Supplies in the 2024 Player's Handbook say that they are dexterity-based checks. So again, I don't know if they're intending that this is supposed to say Dexterity Calligrapher Supplies, but in my opinion, they should remove that Intelligence Herbalism Kit check from that initial feat that had that feature on it. Then looking at the greater Mark of Scribing, we have Inspired Scribing. This one says whenever you cast Comprehend Languages, you can modify the spell to cause a sigil to appear in the air above a creature you can see within 30 feet of yourself, which lasts for the duration of the spell. While it persists, enemies within 30 feet of the creature must spend 2 feet of movement for every 1 foot they move closer to that creature. The sigil disappears if that creature makes an attack roll, casts a spell, or deals damage. So you can almost think of this as like a soft sanctuary because it ends if the creature kind of does anything. Notably, it doesn't end if they force the creature to make a saving throw. They're already concentrating on a spell that just imposes multiple saving throws, like a stinking cloud or something like that. You know, causing the creatures to make that saving throw is not going to end this effect. I think it's also interesting that it says that you don't need to use this effect on a willing creature, so you could cast this on an enemy. I mean, an enemy is more likely to try to attack, cast a spell, or deal damage. But it's also worth noting that dead creatures are still creatures, so you could cast this on a dead creature and basically create like this sort of 30-foot radius around it if they're trying to chase you past it, where they have to spend double the movement to get past it. And of course, this is not a difficult terrain. They just have to spend extra movement to get across it. So it's sort of like a plant growth sort of effect, but not quite as strong. I think it's going to be one of those things where it doesn't seem as powerful on the surface as some of the others. But I think this is one of those things that, you know, a clever player can find really good uses for. It is also worth noting that this one is not limited to once per long rest. You do only get it for free once per long rest, but if you wanted to cause this effect again, you certainly could. Moving on to Mark of Sentinel, this one's basically completely unchanged other than the normal spellcasting changes here. This one specifically does get the shield spell always prepared, so it turns out when they give you one of the most powerful first level spells, they probably don't feel like you need a lot of buffs. But then looking at the greater Mark of Sentinel, it says Improved Sentinel. When you cast Shield, you can modify the spell so that it magically marks a creature you can see within 30 feet of you till the end of its next turn. While marked, the target must spend 2 feet of movement for every 1 foot of movement they move away from you. So this is very similar to the effect of the greater Mark of Scribing. That one did it in an area of effect to creatures around a certain creature. It affected them when they're trying to approach that creature, whereas this one only affects one creature and it prevents them from moving so fast when they're trying to get away from you. And then again, also like that feature, this one can also be used any number of times every time that you cast Shield if you wanted to. And for that reason, there's no reason not to do it each time that you cast Shield anyway. I don't know that Shield needed to be better, but this is a pretty decent buff as well. Moving on to Mark of Shadow. This one again is pretty much unchanged other than the normal spellcasting changes. And then for the greater Mark of Shadow, we have Improved Shadow that says when you cast invisibility on yourself, you can modify the spell to also affect one willing creature within 5 feet of yourself. The condition ends immediately if an affected creature makes an attack roll, deals damage, or casts a spell. And then you can only do this one once per long rest. So that's pretty cool. Invisibility gets more targets when you upcast it. So this is basically a free 3rd level invisibility once per long rest. There's definitely a lot of shenanigans you can get up to with a feature like this. For the Mark of the Storm, again, same spellcasting changes that we've seen across the board. And then because we get Gust of Wind always prepared, that was removed from the expanded spell list and replaced with Shatter. And it is also worth noting that this expanded spell list also contains Conjure Minor Elementals, which it also did previously. But as we know, Conjure Minor Elementals in 2024 is kind of busted, especially if you upcast it. So if you're trying to work Conjure Minor Elementals into a build that doesn't normally have access to it, this is one way that you could do it if you are in the Eberron setting, or if your DM is allowing these feats in a non-Eberron setting. Then as we look at the greater Mark of Storm, we have Improved Storm. It says when you cast Gust of Wind, you can modify the spell so that you gain a fly speed equal to half your speed rounded down for the duration of the spell. And then once you modify the spell, you can't do it again until you finish a long rest. So Gust of Wind is a second level spell. It only lasts 1 minute, but 1 minute is certainly long enough for a combat at least. You're not able to fly quite as fast as the normal fly spell at 3rd level, but again, you're getting this for free and also as a 2nd level spell. This is also going to be particularly good for monks that don't normally have access to spell casting, but also have an increased movement speed, such as your barbarians and your monks. Even a rogue with their ability to dash as a bonus action can fly a little bit faster that way as well. And so again, just a very cool way to build upon a spell that people probably aren't normally using. Then we move on to Mark of Warding. One thing that was removed is that you can now no longer ignore the material components for the spells that are provided through the Wards and Seals feature. Because we always have the Alarm and Arcane Lock spells always prepared, that was replaced in the expanded spell list with Sanctuary and Nistil's Magic Aura. Then as we look at the greater Mark of Warding, we have Improved Warding. It says when you cast Mage Armor on yourself, you can modify the spell to also affect one willing creature you can see within 30 feet of yourself. And then once you do this, you can't do it again until you finish a long rest. This might actually make me want to cast Mage Armor because you do get it for free at least once per day. Mage Armor lasts, I believe, 8 hours. So that's basically 1 adventuring day, assuming that it doesn't get dispelled. And then you can also cast it on a fellow ally. You can cast it on your familiar if that would boost their AC, or any other summoned creature that would have a lower AC without it. You can cast it on, a fellow wizard or sorcerer to save them their spell slot as well. You can cast it on, your barbarians or your monks if they would have a higher AC with that instead of using their normal armor, or if they're using their unarmored defense. So there's a lot of different ways that you can find a way to use this depending on your group. This doesn't get me necessarily excited about casting Mage Armor, but I do think this is actually pretty useful. Definitely early game while people's armor classes are still pretty low, but even in late game, again, you can boost your familiar's AC or anything like that. So those are all the specific Dragonmark feats for the actual marks themselves, the Aberrant Dragonmarks, and then all the house marks of Eberron. And then there are 2 sort of new feats to the Eberron setting that they added as well. One is a general feat, and this one is called Potent Dragonmark. Potent Dragonmark is another, again, general feat, so you need to be level 4+. You need to have a Dragonmark feat in order to take this feat. This one says you can increase the spellcasting ability score used by your Dragonmark feat by 1 to a maximum of 20. So when you choose one of those previous origin feats that you got before, you had to choose a spellcasting ability modifier for those spells. That is the ability score that would be increased by this feat. It then also says Dragonmark Preparation. It says you always have the spells on your Dragonmark feats, spells of the mark list, if any, prepared. So all of those expanded spell lists that normally added those spells to your class spell list so you could choose them when you level up. Instead of having to do that when you take this feat, you just have all of those spells prepared when you reach the appropriate level for them. So I'd say this feature alone is worth the feat. Any class would love this, whether or not they already get their own prepared spell list, like the Sorcerer has a lot of it now, Cleric subclasses. But again, especially spellcasting classes that don't normally get one, like the Bard, I think would really love this as well. So yeah, that's really strong on its own, but that doesn't even stop there. So then you also have a feature called Dragonmark Spellcasting. It says you have 1 spell slot to cast the spells granted by your Dragonmark feat. The spell slot's level is 1/2 of your level rounded up to a maximum level of 5. You regain the expended spell slot when you finish a short or long rest. You can use the spell slot to only cast a spell that you have prepared because of your Dragonmark feat or the Dragonmark Preparation benefit of this feat. So one thing to note here is that the Dragonmark Preparation feature of this feat does not benefit the Aberrant Dragonmark feat because they don't have an expanded spell list for that feat, but the Dragonmark Spellcasting would. The Aberrant Dragonmark is to choose 1 sorcerer level of 1st level. So you only get that 1 spell, but if you specifically choose a spell that upcasts very well, then you can cast it using this bigger spell slot, basically this Warlock spell slot, once per short rest. This is crazy. Like, again, when I was making this video, when I was going through this video, when I was going through the normal Dragonmark and greater Dragonmark feats, I was like, okay, yeah, these are fine. This one made me sit up in my chair and be like, okay, I'm sorry, what does this say again? You basically get a packed magic slot, and this refreshes on a short rest, and I have this now slew of newly prepared spells that I can possibly cast with this higher level, basically free spell slot. That is actually pretty nuts. I'm a big fan of this feat. So that then motivated me to actually look at each of the individual spell lists and kind of look at which spells have pretty good upcasting effects. So then I put together this table. So I'm only including spells that don't upcast for more damage only, because of course those are good. But for the Aberrant Dragonmark, of course, again, they can only choose one sorcerer spell. You have things like Chromatic Orb, False Life, and Fog Cloud, and Magic Missile. Chromatic Orb not only deals more damage, but then it has a higher chance to bounce each time per spell level. And again, I did a whole video on the math of Chromatic Orb in 2024. I'll link that in the notes or whatever it is around here. You can maybe watch that after this one. False Life is just a lot more temporary hit points if you're casting that at 5th level. The radius of Fog Cloud increases by 20 feet per spell level. Magic Missile, it is just more damage, but it is unavoidable damage. And if you have spell damage riders, like your Hexblade's Curse sort of thing, then you can kind of buff the damage of Magic Missile that way. Notably, the Dragonmarks of Detection and Sentinel, they don't have any spells that upcast at all, so I think that is a pretty big gap that they would need to address. I don't think every Dragonmark needs to be great with the potent Dragonmark feat, but they should at least gain some benefit from it other than just getting all those spells prepared. Mark of Finding has Hunter's Mark for a longer duration. Longstrider to cast it on more targets. You can basically buff your whole party's movement speed as you enter a dungeon, which is great. Mark of Handling has Animal Friendship, which is more targets, command more targets. Dominate Beast would last 10 minutes at 5th level compared to 1 minute at 4th level. Mark of Healing, Cure of Wounds is just a lot more healing. False Life, again, a lot more temporary hit points. Healing Word, more healing. Arcane Vigor, more healing. Mark of Hospitality has Aid. It only has Aid for the good upcasting, but Aid is a very good spell. Your 5th level spell slot, that's 20 extra hit points for 3 creatures. Again, not temporary hit points, just full hit points for, it's like 8 hours. So that's very powerful as well. Mark of Making has Magic Weapon. So Magic Weapon, once you can cast it at 3rd to 5th level, is a +2 weapon instead of +1. So again, you're casting that for free once per long rest. You can turn it into a mini defender once per long rest, and then you can cast it using this sort of Pact Magic spell slot through this feat once per short rest at least. So that's just a very powerful effect. Again, that's an on-demand defender at least once per day, which is just there's so many cool things you can do with these feats. Mark of Passage has Find Steed and Freedom of Movement. Find Steed stat block has a number of features that scale with spell level. It also has a flight speed once you can cast it at 4th level or higher. Freedom of Movement is just more targets. Mark of Scribing has Command Animal Messenger, which lasts 48 hours per spell level above 2. And then Confusion, the radius increases by 5 feet per spell level. Mark of Shadow has Invisibility, which has more targets per spell level. So at 5th level, that's up to 4 creatures as a 5th level spell, once per short rest. Major Image, once you can cast it at 4th level or higher, no longer requires concentration and it lasts until dispelled. Mark of Storm has Fog Cloud again, and then Conjure Minor Elementals. And I know I said I wasn't going to include spells that only deal more damage, but in terms of only dealing more damage, Conjure Minor Elementals is a big standout. It is only 1 spell level higher once you can cast it at 5th level. But again, if that's free once per short rest, that is a very powerful effect that is really going to mow through combat encounters. So if you have a martial character in Eberron that is investing in this, if this goes live as is, keep an eye out for that one. And finally, Mark of Warding has Armor of Agathis, which of course is just more temporary hit points and then more damage in melee combat. Glyph of Warding has the upcasting when you use the spell storing version of it. So you can store a spell of a higher spell level. You do need to consume the spell slot for that spell to do it. You do basically get a free Glyph of Warding minus the cost of the spell itself to do that. And then Magic Circle, of course, its duration increases per spell level as well. So some of the origin feats definitely benefit from this more than the other. I think that's perfectly fine. They don't all need to be great, but even if they aren't sort of obviously powerful, I still think there are a lot of good things that you can do with pretty much everything here. I do think that the Mark of Detection and Mark of Sentinel need something, but overall this is a ridiculous feat. I'd be a little surprised if they publish this as is, but I kind of also want them to. So that's going to bring us to the final and the last feat, that is the Epic Boon. The epic boon that they're proposing to add to the Eberron setting is the Boon of Siberys, or Siberys. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. You can increase one ability score of your choice up by 1 up to a maximum of 30. Then it has Aberrant Magic. It says choose a spell of any level from the Sorcerer spell list or from the spells of the Siberys Dragonmark table. You always have that spell prepared. You can cast it once without a spell slot. You regain the ability to cast it that way when you finish a short or long rest. Then you can also cast that spell using any spell slots that you have. And then you can choose Intelligence, Wisdom, or Charisma as your spellcasting ability modifier for that spell. It lists the table for those spells down there at the bottom. I included the level of each spell between the Dragonmark and the spell names, and then the ones with stars next to them are ones that aren't normally available on the Sorcerer spell list, because you can either choose from a Sorcerer spell list or choose from this table. I will say that I'm not sure that they intend it, so if you are choosing from the Siberys Dragonmark's table, that you need to choose the one that is associated with the Dragonmark that you have, if you have a Dragonmark, or that you would even need a Dragonmark to get the spell from that. The Aberrant Magic feature doesn't doesn't specify that, although it seems like that's what they want you to do. So that's a little unclear. But either way, again, this is an extraordinarily powerful effect where you basically have a free high level spell once per short rest. Again, that can be a 9th level spell by this level because you're level 19 or higher. You don't need to have a spell slot to even cast it. So even if you're a barbarian and you don't have a class or a subclass that has spell slots, you can still cast a 9th level spell if you wanted to once per short rest using this feature. So yeah, those are all of the feats that were released in the Eberron Unearthed Arcana. Again, I'm not familiar with the Eberron setting, so I don't know if is it a more high power fantasy setting where things like the potent Dragonmark feat and the Boon of Siberys make sense to give the power level to the players that they have. Both of those feats seem to be pushing the envelope on the normal power scaling that we see for players, at least from things that we see from Wizards of the Coast. And again, this is just playtest material. You know, we might see it change before it goes live, but I do hesitate to call them overpowered. Again, I would call them overpowered in comparison to other things that we usually see released from Wizards of the Coast, but I do think that 5th edition has a lot of room for this sort of high power fantasy play. It's kind of what I wish maybe Spelljammer would have been, where you can just kind of get weird with things. And, you know, if you're a DM who wants to be able to throw like wild encounters and like, you know, increasingly, you know, difficult, interesting, but also fun encounters at your players, you also need to make sure that your players have the tools to deal with those wild, crazy encounters and difficult monsters. And, you know, this is a way to do that kind of thing. And we don't normally see this sort of direction from Wizards of the Coast to really boost the power level of 5th edition in such an extreme way. And again, it is locked within a certain setting, but I do like that it's here and that it is sort of an example of what you could do if you wanted to increase the power level of your adventures. Maybe newer DMs who aren't as confident with homebrewing higher power fantasy adventures and things like that without risking TPKing their party have this sort of example of how to do that. And of course, right now they're doing that just for the players, like these feats and everything are for the players. Hopefully we see some crazy things coming in for the DM in the Eberron campaign setting as well that would justify feats of this power. So outside of the few changes that I pointed out throughout this video, I really wouldn't change anything. And I think if I were Wizards of the Coast, outside of buffing those small changes that I mentioned, I would just send this as is and see what the players do with it. I think this is a good path forward for playing with power creep because they are locking it within a specific setting. You know, if a DM doesn't want to play with this, so they can just say, we're not an Eberron, we're not going to do that. But if you do want to do that, then you do have this available for you. So I personally like it a lot, but you can let me know what you think down in the comments below. You know, what are your thoughts specifically about the sort of increased power level of these last two feats? Or just let me know anything that you thought about any of the feats presented in this video. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you're a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all of your time, and I'll see you in the next one.